The autumn sun was sinking behind the row of maples that lined Margaret Cole's quiet street. When she first noticed it, the smell that clung to the straps of her granddaughter Lily's backpack. Margaret was 62 years old, a retired nurse who had spent her life trusting her instincts about illness and injury, and now those instincts screamed at her. The girl had just returned from another weekend with her father Daniel Price, and as always, Margaret was the one to greet her at the porch steps. Helen, her daughter, was still at work trying to hold down the late shift at the diner that kept a roof over their heads. Margaret bent down smiling to make Lily feel safe, but the little girl's shoulders drooped beneath the weight of the backpack as if she were carrying a sack of stones. When Margaret reached for it, the odor hit her like a physical blow. It was not the simple smell of a forgotten sandwich or sour milk. This was sharper, darker, something metallic laced with decay, the unmistakable tang she remembered from her hospital days, when an untreated wound festered too long. Lily's pale face gave away nothing, but her small hands clutched her stuffed rabbit as if for dear life. Margaret's heart pounded. She tried to steady her voice. "Honey, what did you bring home this time? Is there something messy in here?" She forced a smile, but the girl looked away, biting her lip. Margaret carried the backpack into the kitchen, the smell growing stronger with each step. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of the wall clock, but inside Margaret's chest was a drumbeat. She set the bag on the table, pulled the zipper, and the world shifted. Inside lay a crumpled shirt stiff with dried blood, the fabric crusted and dark. Beneath it, a roll of filthy gauze, half unspooled, clotted with something foul. And at the bottom, gleaming faintly even in the fading light, was a small pocket knife, its blade jagged, chipped, and smeared with what looked like rust. But Margaret knew better. It was fresh enough to carry that iron scent she would never forget. For a moment, she could not breathe. Her mind flashed back to the emergency room, to nights when young men staggered in after bar fights, to the smell that always clung to trauma. But this was not a stranger. This was her 9-year-old granddaughter's bag. Margaret staggered back, one hand gripping the counter for balance. Lily stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, not with curiosity, but with fear, as if she already knew what Margaret had uncovered. "Grandma, please don't be mad," she whispered. The words sliced Margaret more deeply than the knife in that bag. She crouched quickly, holding the girl's trembling shoulders. "Sweetheart, tell me what happened. Did someone hurt you?" But Lily shook her head violently, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He said not to tell. He said it would be worse if I told." Margaret felt the cold grip of rage and dread curl around her spine. She had warned Helen for months that Daniel was no safe man. She had seen the bruises on her daughter years ago, the lies Daniel spun, the way he twisted truth until Helen doubted her own sanity. And now it was happening again, this time to Lily. Margaret rose with a steadiness born from decades of nursing crises. She picked up the phone, her hands trembling but her voice firm. "911, she said as soon as the operator answered. "I need help. I found evidence of blood and a weapon in my granddaughter's backpack. She has been with her father all weekend. I believe she is in danger." As she gave the address, Margaret's eyes never left Lily's fragile form. The girl clung to her rabbit, rocking back and forth, whispering something inaudible. Margaret leaned closer and caught the words, "Daddy said nobody will believe you." The sentence crystallized everything: gaslighting, intimidation, violence, all wrapped into one poisonous legacy. Margaret felt the fury of every suppressed scream from Helen's past and every bruise hidden under long sleeves. "No more," she vowed silently. "This ends tonight." Outside, the wail of approaching sirens split the evening calm, echoing off the quiet houses. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, drawn by the sound. Margaret held her granddaughter close, whispering, "You are safe now, darling. You are safe with me." She knew the road ahead would not be easy. Daniel would deny, twist, threaten. But Margaret had seen too much to doubt her instincts. The bloodied shirt, the knife, the smell of rot were not lies. They were evidence. They were the opening shots in a battle she was ready to fight for Lily's life. And as the flashing red and blue lights painted her living room walls, Margaret realized something else. For the first time in years, she did not feel helpless. She felt a righteous fire rising, one that would not be extinguished until the truth was laid bare in front of everyone, until Daniel Price was stripped of his power and exposed for what he truly was. She tightened her hold on Lily and whispered a promise: "I will protect you. I will make sure he never hurts you again." The knock thundered at the door, officers calling out her name. Margaret straightened her back, inhaled deeply, and opened the door to the beginning of war. Margaret Cole had not planned for her golden years to be a battlefield, but life had forced her into the trenches more than once. She had raised her daughter Helen almost entirely on her own, after her husband died young from a factory accident. Helen had been the joy of her life, a bright child with dreams of becoming a teacher. When she met Daniel Price, Margaret had tried to be supportive. Daniel was charming in those early days, tall with a quick smile and a smooth way of speaking that made Helen feel seen. But Margaret had worked in hospitals long enough to recognize charm that was too polished. There was a hollowness in his eyes, a spark of control disguised as confidence. She warned Helen gently, but her daughter brushed it aside. "I am in love, Mom," she had said back then. "Everyone deserves a chance." Margaret had stayed silent, but she never truly trusted him. The marriage spiraled into darkness within a year. Daniel began to control every aspect of Helen's life, telling her what to wear, who to see, how to spend every dollar. When Helen resisted, he would explode. Margaret remembered the night Helen came to her house with a split lip, insisting she had walked into a door. The lie was too obvious, but Helen clung to it because admitting the truth meant confronting the trap she was in. By the time Lily was born, the cycle was cemented. Daniel would rage, then apologize with flowers and promises, then rage again twice as hard. Margaret offered Helen shelter countless times, but Daniel's gaslighting was effective. He told Helen she was worthless, that no court would give her custody, that Margaret was trying to poison her against him. Helen believed just enough of the lies to stay. It took nearly a decade before she finally broke free. Margaret remembered that night vividly. Helen had shown up trembling, holding Lily, who was barely 4. Her face was bruised, her arms marked with finger-shaped welts. "Mom," she whispered, "I can't do it anymore." That was the turning point. With Margaret's support, Helen filed for divorce. The process was grueling. Daniel fought with venom, accusing Helen of infidelity, of mental instability, of inventing abuse. He hired lawyers who twisted every word. Margaret sat beside her daughter through every hearing, whispering strength into her ear. At last, the divorce was finalized, and Helen was granted primary custody, though Daniel was given visitation rights every other weekend. Margaret had tried to be grateful for that small victory. But each time Lily left with her father, Margaret felt the same knot of dread in her stomach. In the 3 years since the divorce, that dread had only grown. At first, Lily would come home sullen, refusing to talk about her visits. Then there were the small bruises on her arms and legs brushed off as playground accidents. Margaret's nurse eyes told her differently. She noticed Lily's appetite diminished after weekends with Daniel. Sometimes the girl woke in the night from nightmares, clutching her rabbit Mr. Buttons, whispering Daddy was yelling again. Helen tried to document everything, keeping a folder of photos, doctor notes, and text messages. But Daniel was slippery. He portrayed himself as the devoted father struggling against a vindictive ex-wife. To outsiders, he was plausible. To those who lived it, he was a monster. Margaret saw how Daniel used gaslighting not just on Helen, but on Lily as well. He would tell the child, "Your mom exaggerates. Grandma hates me. If you talk about what happens, no one will believe you." Over time, Margaret recognized the patterns of coercion. She had seen victims in the ER broken not just in body but in spirit, convinced they were the cause of their own suffering. She vowed Lily would not become one of them. Still, Daniel played his role carefully in public. At school functions, he arrived in pressed shirts, shaking hands with teachers, smiling for photos. He paid child support just enough to avoid contempt charges. He bought Lily toys he knew would make him look generous. But behind the mask, Margaret glimpsed the old rage, the way his jaw clenched when Helen spoke, the veiled threats in emails. Once he had written, "If you try to cut me out, I will bury you in court. You and your mother both." Helen showed Margaret the message with shaking hands. They brought it to their lawyer, but without physical proof of abuse, it was just another brick in the wall of intimidation. Daniel's new tactic was whispering about custody. He bragged to coworkers and mutual friends that he was preparing to petition for full custody, painting Helen as unstable and Margaret as manipulative. It was classic Daniel flipping reality to make himself the victim. Margaret knew he was setting the stage for something. That was why every return from his house felt like Russian roulette. Would Lily come home safe, or would there be another sign, another scar, another piece of evidence too small for the court, but too large for Margaret to ignore? She carried the weight of vigilance while Helen struggled to keep their small family afloat financially. Helen worked long shifts at the diner, often double shifts, just to pay rent and utilities. Margaret picked up the slack caring for Lily after school, cooking meals, helping with homework. She did it gladly, but she could not shield the child from weekends with her father. Those were court-ordered. They were the chinks in their armor. And lately the cracks had widened. 2 months before the discovery of the bloody backpack, Lily had returned with a welt across her shoulder. Margaret demanded to know what happened. Lily mumbled something about falling off the couch, but the mark was too straight, too deliberate. Helen wanted to confront Daniel immediately, but Margaret urged patience until they had something undeniable. They both knew how Daniel twisted confrontation into proof of harassment. They needed irrefutable evidence. That knowledge haunted Margaret. Every bruise, every tear felt like a failure. She replayed the past in her mind, the year she begged Helen to leave, the year she stood powerless as her daughter was beaten and belittled. She carried that guilt like a stone. Now with Lily, she swore she would not repeat the same mistakes. And then came that Sunday evening, the smell that changed everything. The backpack had opened a door Daniel could never close again. Margaret did not yet know what story the blood and knife told, but she knew one thing for certain. The fight of her life was about to begin. The days leading up to the backpack discovery had already been tense. Margaret could sense that Daniel was preparing something bigger than his usual intimidation. Helen had confided to her mother late one night after Lily had gone to bed. She whispered across the kitchen table, her face lit only by the dim bulb overhead. "Mom, he is threatening to take her away. He said he is talking to a lawyer about getting full custody." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. She had expected this move sooner or later. Daniel's pattern was predictable rage followed by escalation. He could not stand the idea of Helen having control or of Margaret being the stable figure in Lily's life. He had to dominate or he was nothing. Helen continued, her voice trembling. "He emailed me yesterday. He said I am unfit. He said Lily is better off with him. He even wrote that you brainwash her against him." Margaret read the email carefully, noting the subtle manipulation. It was classic gaslighting wrapped in legal threats. Daniel was laying groundwork to frame himself as the competent parent, and Helen as the hysterical mother. Margaret had no doubt he would fabricate stories. He had always been skilled at bending truth until it snapped. Over the following weeks, Lily grew quieter. Margaret noticed her eating less, barely touching the food she once loved. The girl's eyes had dark circles, and she startled easily at sudden noises. One evening, as Margaret tucked her in, Lily clutched Mr. Buttons and whispered, "Grandma, can you sleep in my room tonight? I do not like being alone." Margaret's chest ached, but she smiled gently, climbing into the small bed beside her. She could feel the child trembling under the blanket. Lily murmured, "Daddy gets mad when I talk too much. He says I should be quiet like a good girl." Margaret bit her tongue, fighting the surge of rage. She stroked Lily's hair until the girl drifted into uneasy sleep. Margaret knew these were not isolated moments. They were cumulative bricks in a wall of fear Daniel was building inside his daughter's mind. Margaret began to keep her own notes, a small notebook hidden in the drawer of her nightstand. She wrote down every bruise, every whispered confession, every odd behavior. She dated each entry like she had once charted patient vitals. It was the nurse in her methodical precise, but it was also the grandmother desperate to build a case. She suspected that one day those notes might be all that stood between Lily and danger. Meanwhile, Helen's exhaustion deepened. She worked herself ragged at the diner, picking up extra tables every chance she got. Margaret watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and worry. Helen had survived hell, and she carried scars both visible and invisible. Yet Daniel still haunted her. When he texted, she jumped. When the phone rang, she froze. It was as if his shadow stretched across miles and years. Margaret tried to reassure her. "We will not let him take her. We have the truth on our side." But even as she said it, she knew truth was not always enough. Daniel's type thrived in distortion. 2 weeks before the bloody backpack, Margaret overheard a phone call that chilled her. Daniel had called Helen late at night. Margaret stood quietly by the doorway as Helen tried to stay calm. "You will not keep me from my daughter." Daniel snarled through the receiver. "If you try, you will regret it." Helen's voice shook as she told him Lily was not feeling well and needed rest. Daniel laughed cruelly. "Maybe she is sick because of you. Maybe I will tell the judge you neglect her." Then he hung up, leaving silence heavy in the kitchen. Helen collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Margaret wrapped her arms around her daughter, whispering the strength she wished she could pour directly into her veins. The gaslighting was relentless. Daniel attacked their confidence at every turn, undermining their sense of safety. Margaret recognized the tactic well. It was not just violence of fists, but violence of mind. One Friday afternoon, when Margaret picked Lily up from school, the teacher pulled her aside. She mentioned that Lily seemed distracted and had fallen asleep during class twice that week. Margaret thanked her, but inside, panic grew. Sleep disruption was another sign, another symptom. That night, Margaret tried to ask gently, "Sweetheart, do you sleep okay at Daddy's house?" Lily hesitated, twisting Mr. Buttons in her lap. "Sometimes I cannot sleep," she admitted. "It is noisy." "Who makes the noise?" Margaret pressed softly. Lily's eyes filled with tears. "Daddy and his friend Jimmy. They yell a lot. Sometimes they throw things." She swallowed. "Sometimes he makes me stay in the bedroom." Margaret's hands clenched. She wanted to storm across town and tear Daniel's door off its hinges, but she forced herself calm. Evidence, she reminded herself. They needed undeniable evidence. Yet the more she waited, the deeper Lily sank into silence. The girl stopped drawing colorful pictures instead, sketching dark scribbles of houses with no windows. Margaret showed them to Helen, whose eyes brimmed with tears. "This is not normal, Mom. Something terrible is happening there." Margaret knew it too. The dread thickened like a storm cloud gathering over their small family. It was in that climate of fear and suspicion that the bloody backpack arrived, sealing what Margaret already felt in her bones. That Daniel Price was not only unfit, but dangerous, and that their time to act had run out. Sunday evening had always been the hardest time of the week for Margaret Cole. She would pace the living room, checking the clock while waiting for Daniel to drop Lily off after his weekend visitation. That particular evening, the sky was bruised with gray clouds, and the air smelled of impending rain. Margaret stood on the porch, scanning the street, when she saw Daniel's dented sedan crawl to a stop. Lily stepped out slowly, her shoulders slumped under the weight of her backpack. Even from a distance, Margaret saw the strain in the child's face. Daniel did not bother to walk her up. He leaned across the passenger seat window shouting, "See you in 2 weeks, princess," before pulling away with a screech of tires. Margaret's jaw tightened. She guided Lily inside and asked about her weekend, but the child mumbled only a faint, "It was okay." Margaret reached for the backpack, and the moment her fingers touched the strap, she froze. The odor radiating from it was vile, not the sourness of old food, but something metallic mixed with rot. Her nurse's instinct flared instantly. She carried the bag to the kitchen, her hands trembling. Lily hovered in the doorway, eyes wide as if anticipating trouble. Margaret unzipped the pack, and the smell hit her full force. Inside was a crumpled shirt smeared with dried blood, stiff and foul. Beneath it, a roll of soiled gauze clotted with something dark. At the bottom lay a pocket knife, its blade chipped, stained with reddish brown. Margaret's breath caught. For a heartbeat, the room spun. This was not neglect. This was violence. She turned to Lily, her voice steady but urgent. "Honey, what is this? Did you hurt yourself?" The girl shook her head, tears spilling. "He said not to tell Grandma. He said it would be worse if I did." Margaret's blood ran cold. "Who?" Lily hesitated, clutching her stuffed rabbit tighter. "Daddy. He said if I talked, no one would believe me." The words shattered Margaret's last thread of restraint. She snatched the phone, dialing 911. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. "This is Margaret Cole at 214 Maple Street. My 9-year-old granddaughter just came home from her father's. Her backpack contains a bloodied shirt and a knife. I believe she is in immediate danger. Send someone now." The dispatcher's calm voice promised officers were on their way. Margaret hung up and knelt beside Lily, who trembled like a leaf. "Sweetheart, you are safe now," she whispered, stroking her hair. "No one will hurt you again." Moments later, sirens wailed through the neighborhood, red and blue lights flickering across the windows. Neighbors peeked from curtains whispering. Officers pounded on the door. Margaret ushered them in, showing the contents of the backpack. The younger officer gagged at the smell, while the older one set his jaw grim. They photographed everything, bagged the items as evidence. One officer gently knelt to Lily's level, asking soft questions. "Did someone give you this shirt?" Sweetie, Lily whispered, barely audible. "Daddy said to keep it in my bag. He said it was a secret." The officer's face hardened. They promised to take her statement in a safe environment. Within the hour, Child Protective Services arrived. The caseworker, a woman named Karen Patel, examined Lily carefully, noting bruises along her arms. She asked Margaret to recount everything the girl had said. Margaret's voice cracked as she repeated the words. "Daddy said nobody will believe you." By the time Helen rushed home from her shift, the living room was crowded with uniforms and clipboards. She burst into tears, seeing Lily curled on the couch clutching Mr. Buttons while an officer stood guard. Helen demanded to know what happened, and Margaret explained quickly, showing her the photographs of the bloodied shirt and knife. Helen's face went pale. "That monster," she whispered. "I knew it. I knew he would escalate." CPS arranged for Lily to be taken to the hospital for immediate evaluation. Margaret insisted on riding along. In the fluorescent glare of the emergency ward, doctors examined Lily, documenting every bruise, every scar. They swabbed the dried blood on the shirt and gauze for testing. The lead physician pulled Margaret aside, lowering his voice. "These are not accidental injuries. Whoever is responsible has put this child at serious risk." Margaret nodded, her heart a storm of fear and fury. Helen clung to her daughter, sobbing, but Margaret stood tall, her old nurse's composure returning. This was evidence. This was undeniable. At nearly midnight, officers returned from Daniel's apartment with disturbing news. They had found signs of a struggle, broken glass stains on the carpet, and neighbors reported hearing shouting and crying the previous night. Daniel himself was not there. He had vanished. The news sent a chill down Margaret's spine. A man like Daniel on the run was a dangerous thing. Helen clutched her daughter tighter, whispering that she would never let him near again. Margaret looked around at the officers, at the CPS worker, at the medical staff, and felt both relief and dread. Relief that they finally had evidence strong enough to expose him. Dread that the battle was only beginning. As they left the hospital in the early hours, Margaret carried the backpack sealed now in an evidence bag. The stench still clung to her memory, the smell of violence hidden in plain sight. She vowed silently that Daniel would face the full weight of justice, no matter how long it took. This was no longer just about suspicion or bruises brushed off as accidents. This was proof carved in blood and steel. And Margaret Cole, a grandmother who had spent her life healing others, was now ready to fight like never before, to protect her granddaughter from the man who had already stolen too much. The hours that followed blurred together for Margaret, but she forced herself to remain steady because Helen was unraveling. At the hospital, CPS secured temporary protective custody, placing Lily officially in Helen's and Margaret's care while the investigation unfolded. Officers assured them Daniel's visitation was suspended immediately. Still, the thought of him loose somewhere in town kept Margaret on edge. She had seen too many cases in her nursing days where abusers escalated once they felt their control slipping. The next morning, detectives arrived at Margaret's house to take formal statements. Detective Carla Ruiz, a seasoned investigator with sharp eyes, sat across from Margaret at the dining table recorder, clicking on. "Mrs. Cole, please walk us through exactly what you found." Margaret described the smell, the bloodied shirt, the gauze, the knife. She repeated Lily's words about Daniel warning her not to tell, every detail etched like fire in her memory. Ruiz nodded gravely. "This is serious. The physical evidence combined with your granddaughter's statement gives us probable cause for arrest. The problem is, we have not located Mr. Price yet." Margaret clenched her hands. "He will run. He always runs when the truth comes close." Ruiz held her gaze. "And when he does, we will find him." Over the next days, the investigation expanded. Forensics confirmed the blood on the shirt was human, and matched Lily's DNA. The knife had both Lily's and Daniel's fingerprints. That evidence alone was damning, but Ruiz wanted more. She and her partner canvassed Daniel's apartment building, speaking with neighbors. Mrs. Winters, an elderly tenant from the unit next door, admitted she had often heard shouting. That poor child cried herself to sleep more than once, she told the detectives. Another neighbor from across the hall reported seeing Lily with bruises Daniel claimed were from playground accidents. But the most disturbing testimony came from Jimmy Carter, the teenage son of Daniel's friend. Fidgeting nervously, Jimmy admitted that Daniel often left Lily alone while he went out drinking. One time, Jimmy said he heard Daniel screaming, and when he peeked in, he saw him holding his belt in the air, while Lily cowered in the corner. "I did not know what to do," Jimmy muttered. "I should have told someone." Ruiz's jaw tightened. She documented every word. Meanwhile, Margaret continued to keep meticulous notes. Each evening, she wrote down Lily's nightmares, the way she woke screaming, "Daddy, please stop," the way she flinched when anyone raised their voice. Helen tried to comfort her daughter, but she too bore the scars of Daniel's control. Margaret often found her pacing the kitchen at midnight, muttering, "He will twist this, he will say we are lying." Margaret would grab her shoulders, reminding her, "No more lies will protect him. We have the truth now." One afternoon, Ruiz returned with an update. "We have issued a warrant for Daniel's arrest. We believe he may be staying with a cousin in the next county. Until we apprehend him, you need to be cautious. Keep your doors locked. If you see anything suspicious, call immediately." Margaret nodded. She had already reinforced the locks and asked a neighbor to watch the house, but danger still felt close. That night, as rain hammered the windows, Margaret sat awake in her chair, a baseball bat resting by her side. Her mind replayed every moment, every sign she had ignored years earlier, when Helen was suffering under Daniel's hand. Guilt gnawed at her, but beneath it burned fury. He would not break Lily the way he broke Helen. Days stretched into a week. Finally, news came. Daniel had been arrested in a motel 50 miles away. He had checked in under a false name, but an anonymous tip led officers straight to him. Margaret felt both relief and rage as she watched the report on television. He looked disheveled, handcuffed, head bowed. Helen wept seeing him led away, but Margaret's eyes stayed cold. This was only the beginning. The preliminary hearing set the stage for what was to come. Prosecutors presented the evidence: the bloody shirt, the knife, the DNA results, the neighbor testimonies. Daniel's lawyer tried to dismiss it, claiming the items had been planted to frame him. Margaret nearly stood from her seat in outrage, but Ruiz placed a calming hand on her shoulder. The judge denied bail, citing the danger to the child. Daniel was remanded to county jail awaiting trial. Yet the fight was not over. In the weeks that followed, Daniel launched a campaign of manipulation from behind bars. He wrote letters to Helen begging forgiveness, claiming he was framed by Margaret, who always hated him. He filed motions through his lawyer accusing Helen of coaching Lily. He even managed to get sympathetic relatives to call Helen, accusing her of trying to destroy Daniel's life. Helen wavered under the pressure. One evening, Margaret found her daughter sitting at the table clutching one of his letters, tears streaming. "Mom, maybe he is right. Maybe I am poisoning Lily against him." Margaret tore the letter from her hands. "No, Helen, listen to me. That is his poison talking. He used the same tricks on you for years. He will not twist your mind again." Helen sobbed in her arms. Margaret realized Daniel's abuse was not only physical, but generational, a cycle of control that could infect everyone if they let it. She doubled down on her resolve. To counter Daniel's narrative, Margaret began working closely with CPS and the prosecutors. She turned over her notebooks, every page of meticulous notes. She provided contact information for teachers, neighbors, doctors, anyone who had seen signs. She was relentless because she knew men like Daniel relied on silence and doubt. Margaret would give them neither. The investigation uncovered even more disturbing details. Financial records showed Daniel had spent child support money not on Lily, but on alcohol and gambling. Witnesses from the convenience store where he once worked admitted he often came in smelling of liquor, boasting that nobody could take his daughter from him. Most chilling were the photographs found on his phone when police seized it. Images of Lily's bruises, some apparently taken by Daniel himself, as if trophies. Margaret's stomach turned when Ruiz showed her. but she forced herself to look. These were not only scars, they were evidence of his cruelty. They would expose him to the world. As trial approached, Margaret steeled herself. She knew Daniel would fight like a cornered animal. He would try to twist Helen against her mother, pit them against each other. But Margaret also knew something else. For the first time, the truth had weight. It was not whispers or suspicions. It was blood on a shirt, DNA on a blade, bruises documented by doctors, voices of neighbors who had heard the screams. It was undeniable. And Margaret Cole was ready to make sure the whole world saw Daniel Price for what he truly was. The courthouse loomed like a fortress of stone and glass the morning of Daniel Price's trial. Margaret Cole stood at the steps, gripping Helen's hand on one side and Lily's small hand on the other. She was 62, but the weight of the fight had aged her further in recent months. Still, she straightened her shoulders as if she were marching into battle. Inside the courtroom, the air felt electric, packed with observers, reporters, and the faint smell of old wood polish. Daniel entered flanked by deputies, his orange jumpsuit a sharp contrast to the polished lawyer beside him. His hair was unkempt, his jaw shadowed, but his eyes still carried the same arrogant spark, the same belief that he could twist reality to his will. Margaret felt a shiver as his gaze briefly locked with hers, cold and accusing. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair, called the room to order. Opening statements began. The prosecutor, a calm man named Robert Keene, spoke with precision. He laid out the evidence methodically, the bloodied shirt, the knife with DNA, the testimony of neighbors and teachers, the hospital reports. He spoke of a child living under terror and a man who wielded control through violence and fear. When he said the words, this was not an isolated mistake, but a pattern of abuse. Margaret felt the room hold its breath. Daniel's lawyer rose next, trying to weave the familiar web. He claimed Margaret had a vendetta against his client. He suggested Helen was unstable, coached by her mother to fabricate lies. He painted Lily as confused, manipulated. It was gaslighting dressed in legal language. Margaret gripped Helen's hand tighter, whispering, "Do not believe him." The witnesses began. Mrs. Winters, the elderly neighbor, walked slowly to the stand, her cane tapping the floor. She described nights when she heard Lily crying through the walls, the shouting, the sound of glass breaking. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "That little girl was living in fear," she said. Next came Jimmy Carter, the teenage neighbor who admitted he had seen Daniel raise a belt over Lily. He hung his head in shame, saying, "I should have told someone sooner." The jury shifted, visibly disturbed. Then came Dr. Evelyn Cho, the pediatrician who had examined Lily. She detailed the bruises, the malnutrition, the psychological toll. She explained how the DNA confirmed the blood on the shirt was Lily's. Her testimony was clinical, yet devastating. Helen testified next, her voice quivering but resolute. She recounted years of abuse, how Daniel had isolated her, controlled her finances, hit her, gaslighted her. She admitted her own shame for not leaving sooner. Tears streamed down her face as she described the night Lily begged not to go back. The courtroom was silent except for the scratching of pens. Finally, it was Margaret's turn. She walked to the stand, her spine straight, her voice steady. She described finding the backpack, the smell that transported her back to emergency wards, the knife that gleamed with menace. She repeated Lily's words, "Daddy said nobody will believe you." As she spoke, she looked directly at the jury, willing them to feel the urgency, the terror, the truth. The defense tried to rattle her, suggesting she planted the items to frame Daniel. Margaret's eyes blazed. "Sir, I have spent 30 years healing the sick," she declared. "I do not plant evidence, I save lives, and I will not sit silent while my granddaughter's cries are dismissed." The gallery erupted murmurs, hushed only by the gavel. Margaret stepped down, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. Then the prosecutor called the final witness, Lily. Margaret's breath caught. The little girl walked hesitantly to the stand, clutching Mr. Buttons. The judge allowed her to hold the toy while testifying. The prosecutor knelt, speaking gently. "Sweetheart, can you tell us what happened when you were with your father?" Lily's voice was soft but carried across the room. "Daddy gets mad. He yells. He hits, sometimes with his hand, sometimes with the belt. He said if I told, No one would believe me. The jury shifted their gaze from the trembling child to Daniel, who sat stone-faced. The defense tried to cross-examine, but each question only revealed more truth. Lily answered simply with the honesty only a child could bring. At one point, she lifted her sleeve, revealing faint scars. The jury gasped. Margaret's eyes filled, but she stayed silent, her fists clenched in her lap. When Lily finished, she was escorted back to Helen's arms. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the weight of the testimony undeniable. The defense attempted to salvage their case by calling Daniel himself. He strode to the stand, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I love my daughter," he declared. "I would never hurt her. My ex-wife and her mother are conspiring against me. They hate me. They want me gone." He spoke of being unemployed, of trying his best, of being misunderstood. But under cross-examination, the prosecutor dismantled him piece by piece. He asked about the DNA. He asked about the neighbors who heard the screams. He asked why Lily's drawings all showed fear. Daniel grew agitated, his mask slipping. "They are lying," he shouted at one point, slamming his fist on the stand. "They have always lied about me." The jury recoiled. The judge warned him to control himself. But it was too late. His rage was visible, his true nature exposed. Margaret felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The very anger he had wielded as a weapon for years was now damning him in public. Closing arguments sealed the picture. The prosecutor reminded the jury of the evidence, the testimony, the patterns. He spoke of a child finally free to tell the truth. He asked for justice not only for Lily, but for every child silenced by fear. The defense repeated its tired mantra of conspiracy, but the words rang hollow. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman read the verdict: guilty on all counts of child endangerment, abuse, and assault. Margaret closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. Helen sobbed, clutching Lily. Daniel sat frozen, his face pale. The judge's sentence was swift: 12 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 8. Additionally, he was stripped of all custody and visitation rights. The courtroom erupted, murmurs, gasps, some cheers, quickly hushed. Margaret exhaled the breath she had been holding for years. Justice had arrived not as a whisper, but as thunder. As deputies led Daniel away, he turned his glare on Margaret, his lips curling. "This is not over," he hissed. But Margaret met his eyes unflinching. "It is over," she said firmly. "You will never touch her again." He was dragged from the courtroom, his shouts echoing down the hall until the heavy doors swallowed him. Margaret wrapped her arms around her daughter and granddaughter, whispering, "It is done. The storm has passed." For the first time in years, she felt the chains of fear break, replaced by the steady weight of victory. The trial ended, but the echoes of it lingered like smoke after a fire. Margaret Cole walked out of the courthouse into the cold afternoon sunlight, with Helen and Lily beside her. Reporters swarmed, snapping photos, shouting questions. Margaret shielded Lily with her body, refusing to let the child become a spectacle. Helen clutched her daughter tight, tears still streaking her face. They made it to the car, where Margaret finally allowed herself to breathe. For years, she had lived in fear of Daniel's shadow, always anticipating the next outburst, the next manipulation. Now he was behind bars, stripped of his power. Yet freedom came with its own challenges. Lily had survived, but she bore scars, not all visible. That first night after sentencing, Margaret found the girl sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide. "Grandma," she whispered, "is Daddy going to come back?" Margaret sat beside her, brushing hair from her forehead. "No, darling, he cannot come back. He is far away, where he cannot hurt you." Lily studied her face, searching for truth. "Are you sure?" Margaret pulled her close. "I am sure, sweetheart. You are safe now." Lily clung to her until sleep finally claimed her. In the weeks that followed, the community rallied around them. Neighbors who had once watched from behind curtains now appeared with casseroles and gift cards. Mrs. Bennett from down the street brought a handmade quilt sewn with patches from different families, each square a symbol of solidarity. Teachers sent encouraging notes. The church organized a fundraiser to cover therapy costs for Lily. Margaret felt gratitude swelling inside her. After so many years of isolation and silence, she realized they were not alone. Yet healing was not simple. Lily struggled with nightmares waking in tears. She hesitated to trust adults, sometimes even Helen. Margaret arranged sessions with Dr. Meera Patel, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. At first, Lily was reluctant, sitting silently clutching Mr. Buttons. But gradually, through play therapy and gentle conversation, she began to open up. She drew pictures that revealed her fears: the belt, the shouting, the locked bedroom. Each drawing broke Margaret's heart but also gave her hope. Lily was finding a way to express what had been trapped inside. Helen, too, began therapy, encouraged by Margaret. She carried guilt for staying with Daniel too long, for not protecting Lily sooner. Margaret reminded her often, "You left when you could. You saved her. And now you are both healing." Slowly, Helen started to believe it. For Margaret, the hardest part was confronting her own guilt. She replayed memories of warning signs ignored, of bruises excused. She wondered if she could have fought harder years earlier. But Dr. Patel reminded her, healing belonged to all of them. "You cannot change the past, Mrs. Cole," she said gently. "But you changed the future. You broke the cycle." Margaret carried those words like a shield. She began speaking at local support groups for survivors of domestic abuse, sharing her story to help others recognize the patterns of gaslighting, control, and fear. She told them about the smell in the backpack, the evidence that finally shattered Daniel's lies. She spoke of courage, not as the absence of fear, but as action taken in spite of it. Women nodded, tears in their eyes, recognizing themselves in her story. Meanwhile, Daniel's downfall spread through the community. Newspapers ran headlines about his conviction. His former co-workers distanced themselves. Relatives who once defended him fell silent. In prison, reports surfaced of him being combative, lashing out at guards. His reputation was shredded. Margaret did not rejoice in his suffering, but she felt justice had been served. He had built a life on intimidation and lies, and now he was exposed in front of everyone. There was no hiding behind charm, no twisting of truth. The consequence was undeniable. One day, Lily came home from school carrying a drawing. It showed a house with a bright sun and 3 figures holding hands. "That is us," she explained, pointing. "Mommy, Grandma, and me." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She realized the circle of safety they had built was stronger than any shadow Daniel had cast. Months passed. Lily grew brighter, healthier. Her laughter returned, tentative at first, then fuller. Helen began taking night classes at the community college, working toward her dream of teaching. Margaret supported her, babysitting, cheering her on. They were rebuilding piece by piece. On the anniversary of Daniel's sentencing, Margaret lit a single candle, placing it on the windowsill. She told Lily and Helen, "This flame is not for him. It is for us. It reminds us that even in darkness, light can be kept alive." They stood together, watching the candle flicker. Margaret thought of the generations before her, women who had endured in silence. She vowed their line would be different. Lily would grow in truth, not in fear. Justice had drawn a line in the sand. The future would be built on it. In time, Margaret wrote a letter to the judge, thanking her for the courage to see through Daniel's lies. She received a reply months later. "Justice is not perfect," the judge had written, "but courage like yours makes it possible." Margaret framed the letter, placing it on the mantel as a reminder. One spring morning, as flowers bloomed, Margaret sat on the porch with Helen, sipping coffee, while Lily played in the yard. Helen smiled for the first time in a long while, a smile not shadowed by fear. "Mom," she said quietly, "I think we are going to be okay." Margaret looked at her granddaughter chasing butterflies. "Yes," she said firmly, "we are." The scars would never fully vanish, but they no longer defined them. They had chosen survival, chosen truth, chosen each other. That was the legacy they would carry forward. And for Margaret, it was enough. A year after the trial, the rhythm of life for Margaret Cole, Helen, and Lily had shifted into something steadier, something no longer defined by fear. Daniel Price remained behind bars, serving a 12-year sentence with no possibility of parole until Lily was well into her teenage years. That knowledge was both a comfort and a reminder. Margaret never forgot the way he had glared at her in that courtroom, spitting his last threat. Yet she also knew that his words no longer carried power. The locks were secure, the community was vigilant, and most importantly, Lily was free. Healing came in layers. Lily, now 10, had returned fully to school. She laughed more often, she played soccer with friends, she even began art lessons. Her drawings, once filled with dark houses and frightening figures, had blossomed into pictures of bright gardens, smiling faces, and wide-open skies. Sometimes Margaret kept the old ones hidden in a box as proof of how far her granddaughter had come. Helen was thriving too. She completed her certification courses and began working as a teacher's aide at the elementary school. For the first time in years, Margaret saw her daughter walk with pride rather than flinch with anxiety. Helen spoke at community meetings about recognizing abuse, about the insidious power of gaslighting and control. She said openly, "I stayed too long because I believed his lies. I do not want anyone else to make the same mistake." Margaret watched her with awe. The timid girl who once whispered excuses for bruises had become a woman standing tall, telling her truth. As for Margaret, she found purpose in advocacy. She partnered with local shelters, speaking to groups of women about the signs of abuse. She told them about the smell from the backpack, about the moment she chose to act. She said if something feels wrong, trust that instinct. Silence is the weapon abusers count on. Do not give it to them. People listened. Some cried. Some hugged her. Many thanked her for giving them courage. Through it all, Margaret understood that survival was not just about escaping danger, but about building something better afterward. There were still shadows. Lily sometimes woke with nightmares, though less often. Helen still struggled with guilt in quiet moments. Margaret herself carried memories that could never fully fade. But they had built a circle of safety around themselves, reinforced by neighbors, teachers, doctors, and friends. Margaret often thought of the quilt Mrs. Bennet had brought, stitched together from the hands of many. It hung now across Lily's bed, a symbol of community woven into fabric. One evening, as autumn leaves drifted outside the window, Lily sat at the kitchen table working on a school project about family. She asked Grandma, "What does family mean?" Margaret smiled, thinking of the long road behind them. "Family is the people who protect you, who tell you the truth, who help you heal, even when it is hard." Lily nodded carefully, writing down her grandmother's words. Later, Margaret peeked at her drawing. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands with the words, "My family loves me and keeps me safe." For Margaret, that was victory enough. The moral of their journey was clear. Abusers thrive in silence, but justice thrives in truth. Gaslighting can twist reality, but it cannot erase evidence. Fear can hold generations hostage, but courage can break the chain. Margaret Cole once thought her retirement years would be quiet, filled with gardening and church potlucks. Instead, they had been marked by battles in courtrooms and sleepless nights at hospitals. Yet she would not trade the outcome, because in fighting she discovered resilience deeper than she imagined in herself and Helen, and most of all in Lily. When she spoke to other grandparents and support groups, she told them never underestimate your role. You may be the one who sees what others deny. You may be the one who acts when others freeze. And you may be the one who ensures a child's voice is finally heard. As she watched Lily chase fireflies one summer evening, Margaret whispered a prayer of gratitude. Justice had come not only in the form of prison bars, but in the form of healing laughter. And the story of a bloodied backpack, once a symbol of terror, had become instead the catalyst for freedom. The final lesson Margaret carried was simple but powerful. No matter how dark the family's secrets, no matter how strong the abuser's grip, the truth, when spoken aloud, has the power to break chains. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to act, one grandmother who refuses to stay silent.